The Profit Constructors presents a 9.5-part guide to the basic data and reporting in Knowify. Part 9, QuickBooks Online Syncing.
Okay, today we're talking about QuickBooks Online Sync in Knowify. What is there to know and why would I want to know it about my QuickBooks Online Sync? So let's dive right in. So when we are in, let's edit that piece just a little bit, please, Jennifer. Okay, so in order to find out about our QuickBooks Sync, if we're in this newer version of QuickBooks, we can click right here. If you're in the older, not yet upgraded version of Knowify, you can click on your left-hand menu. And that will bring us into this QuickBooks screen. And so we can kind of see a lot of different things are happening here. There's a lot to know and to parse here. So we're just going to spend some time talking about what there is to know about how the QuickBooks Sync should work and what there is to know about if that QuickBooks Sync is working. And then we'll talk about why we want to know that. So we can find out how the QuickBooks Sync should work by using all of these little tabs up here. If we have the setting turned on that says that we want to pull expenses in from QuickBooks, which if you are watching our purchases and bills part of this series earlier, you'll know that that's something that can happen, that you can pull. Not only can you do the data entry in Knowify and have that push one way over into QuickBooks, but because of the two-way sync that's always happening between QuickBooks Online and Knowify, you have the ability to turn on a particular feature on the back end of Knowify that allows you to tell Knowify, yes, I want you to also pull in expenses from QuickBooks. Depending on your workflow and how you are establishing the separation of duties within your office, you may want people entering overhead expenses into Knowify, like we talked about in the very last session of this series, or you may want them entering that into QuickBooks Online. And again, this is dependent on your company and your internal workflows. But if they are entering some types of things in QuickBooks, you may want some of that data to pull from QuickBooks into Knowify. And so this accounts page is the area of Knowify where you'll tell Knowify, I do want you to do that. I want you to pull those expenses over, but only if they're related to these particular accounts. And so you'll want to play around with which accounts you want any expenses that are entered over in QuickBooks to pull back into Knowify. So that's what this accounts page is all about. We're going to skip over the tags for right now, something that's new and a little bit different, but for today, we're just talking about this QuickBooks Online Sync and how to know which things are going back and forth. And so we can take a look and see the default income accounts where things are going to post. So what we prefer for when we're setting up Knowify is that there's a couple of different ways that you can, okay, Jennifer, you can edit all of that. Okay, so in catalog defaults, what we're determining is what of your catalog, and in QuickBooks Online, the equivalent of the catalog is called products and services. And so what we're setting up here in the catalog default screen is what is going to happen when we're pushing anything off of your products and services list or catalog list back into QuickBooks Online. So if we choose to use one of these products or services out of your products and services list, this default income account and default expense account, these two categories are going to be informative to us as to how that data is moving back into QuickBooks. And this is where if we are choosing to use items off the products and services list, we can know how they're going to push back in. So if we just take for an example, this 1022 concrete, that might be a cost code that we're using, 1022, and it's the code that we use for concrete. Every time that we use that code on a client invoice that we're sending out to the client, it will post back to construction income. And every time that we use it on a purchase or a bill, it will post back into supplies and materials COGS. So some things to know and to be cautious about is if we want 1022 concrete to sometimes post to materials and sometimes post to labor, we're going to have to break that down into two separate codes, right? So we'd have to have a 1022 concrete materials and a 1022 concrete labor if we need that to go back into QuickBooks Online in two separate areas of our cost of goods sold on the chart of accounts. Okay, let's go ahead and move forward. Now, then this is going to be talking about when we get to job defaults, we're mostly talking about how things post for those individual jobs. So we have some defaults we can set up. So like when folks are entering their time into Knowify, we can have their time default back to a particular product or service off that product or service list. We can have a default service off of that product or service list for any deposits against the job. So if you regularly accept deposits up front on jobs, you're going to want to set up the correct product or service in QuickBooks Online and have that pushed back the right way on your chart of accounts. And depending on how your Knowify is set up, you may find this default account for retainage option as well. You may not. But if you do have that, that's similar to deposits, going to determine which chart of accounts account on your balance sheet that your retention that's being withheld, retention receivable only, pushes back into QuickBooks Online. And then if you are utilizing both the contract jobs module and the service jobs module, you could set up a default class for each of your contract and service jobs. Alternatively, if you have multiple classes that you need, you could make it a part of your workflow to set up a class for each one of your projects if you have multiple classes. And you could also set up location. So you can utilize the class and location tracking. That's a super functional part of QuickBooks Online to classify and set the location for every single one of your jobs. We can look at income defaults. It's going to be very, very similar to what we were talking about on the job defaults, except for now we're only going to be focusing on those invoices that we send out to our clients and what should happen with them. So we can set up a default income service where everything that we go ahead and send out on that client invoice defaults to that one income service off of the products and services list in QuickBooks Online. We can set that up at the top level company default. And once again, we also have the ability to set that up for each individual project. And we also can set up when we receive funds for those projects and we're posting a payment into Knowify, where should Knowify assume that those payments go to? So this is what that default payment account means. That means when you receive a payment from your client, where should Knowify go ahead and post that payment to in your chart of accounts? So that's going to be typically your main checking account, an income or operating expenses checking account, wherever you post to. So this is, again, now we're telling QuickBooks what to do. So what is there? Oh, let's go ahead and talk about expenses, and then we'll talk about what there is to know what there is. One last thing is on the vendor side, on the purchases and bills side, we can set up a default expense account. Now this is nice. Notice that for both the job defaults for things like labor hours and your default income service, we have to be working off of something that's on the products and services list. And that's because that's how QuickBooks Online works. But when we come over here onto the purchasing side of things, purchases and bills, we don't have to work off of that products and services list anymore. Now we can go straight to accounts on the chart of accounts. So you could say, I want everything by default to post to an uncategorized expense account, which gives you the opportunity to see anything that's not mapped correctly, and then map all of your other vendors based on what they should be, and have those vendors map back to the proper account on your chart of accounts. So anything that you purchase from ABC Supply, you'll say, I want that to show as a supplies and materials cost of goods sold purchase when it's posting back into QuickBooks Online. And same thing with the default payment account. Now, when we're paying vendors out, which default should we assume when we go and write a check? Which check is that coming out? Which checking account if we send an ACH transfer? This is going to be one default account that you can make those payments out for your vendor. So if you enter a payment, record a payment in Knowify out to a vendor, it will default to that one account. Now, if you sometimes pay various vendors with different accounts, you have the ability then to go by vendor and set up that different account. So that's what is there to know about all of those tabs we just went through in a fairly rapid fashion. Well, what there is to know is that this is your area of Knowify where the magic happens when it comes to your QuickBooks Online sync. So if anything in this area gets off or out of whack, you're going to want to have some internal controls to know or understand what that is. And that's why you'll see in a lot of our default setups that the defaults typically are something very generic that we really wouldn't typically want to post something to. And that is by design, because we would want to know when something's not mapped correctly on the back end of Knowify so that we can come in and tweak. So our defaults are typically very generic, and that gives us the ability to understand if something went to that default account, then something's off on the mapping in Knowify and we need to come in here and fix it. And then how do we know that things are actually posting from Knowify into QuickBooks and that everything's going the way it should? Well, we can see on this screen that we're connected, and we can see when the last time was that the two programs, Knowify and QuickBooks Online, synced. And this is also an extremely important thing. We can see that there are 10 errors, and you can see everything that's in green tells us, yep, this was something that was created either in Knowify or in QuickBooks, and that the sync worked properly and things went back and forth and these two programs were talking together well and nicely. We can view it in Knowify, we can view it in QuickBooks, and we can just see that everything is working the way that we thought that it should. But we also see that something down here is in red, and that means it didn't sync properly. And Knowify is telling us why. So it's going to give us data and information that says this is what didn't post properly. And if I just click on this little check mark, I can see only the things that didn't post properly, which is nice, right? It gives me a little bit of ability to do some troubleshooting and understand what didn't happen correctly. And again, you'll want to put checks and balances in place to check this on a regular basis so that you know that everything you're entering into Knowify is going into QuickBooks Online. If you don't check this on a regular basis, you'll find that the two systems end up being out of balance and that something is incorrect between the two. Now, we put a lot of checks and balances on when we're doing this for clients and we're double checking things for them either weekly or monthly. We have a lot more that we do than just this, but this is one of the main areas to come and know, is the sync happening properly between QuickBooks Online and Knowify? And you'll see that it gives you really good data and information about why it didn't happen correctly. And it gives you the ability to fix that. So for this particular transaction, it says there's a duplicate invoice number. And so it's not allowing me to create a new invoice back into QuickBooks Online with this number 40. So you'll see you can't, there's already a 40 in QuickBooks. And now that we've tried once again twice to push another invoice number 40 into QuickBooks Online. And so if I just click on the link, it's going to give me the ability to just go ahead and enter a brand new invoice number right there. And then when I do that and I click save and retry, it will push it through and push it in with the right number. So this is one of the very best ways to know that your data in QuickBooks is valid, because if invalid data in QuickBooks, having the two-way sync between Knowify and QuickBooks just doesn't help us. And a lot of the restrictions that you'll find that are things like that, like you can't have a duplicate invoice number, that's a QuickBooks Online restriction. So Knowify is saying, listen, you could create as many invoice number 40s as you'd like. You can create them all day long over here at Knowify. We don't have a problem with that, but QuickBooks Online won't allow it. So we can't push that data over into QuickBooks until you give us some different number. And I like that it even tells us the last invoice number using QuickBooks is 53. That tells us we're going to want to put 54 in here when we're ready to rectify this problem and get that cleared up and sent over into QuickBooks. So what is there to know? How should QuickBooks and Knowify be talking to each other? Do I have all of my mapping and data set up correctly in the way that I think that it should be over here on the back end? And when something goes wrong, how do I find that data, pull it out, extract it? And why would I want to know that? Well, of course, again, we spoke about it just a few seconds ago. You want to have valid data in QuickBooks Online. And so if we have some data that's entered over here in Knowify, but we can't validate that over in QuickBooks Online, we can't reconcile, and nothing that's going on in QuickBooks Online can we really trust, right? So we just want to always make sure that those two programs are correct and talking back and forth to each other properly, and that they can be reconciled against one another. Next time when we come back, we're going to do a little half-part series. It's going to be really short and sweet about RFIs and submittals.